Okay then, good evening everybody and welcome to the first webinar of the new year from the Red Meat Development Programme, the series of webinars which we're hosting currently. I'm Elizabeth Swancott. I'm on the Red Meat Development Programme as a Programme Officer. I'll be joined this evening by Nicola from SRUC. Nicola has over 20 years experience working in the sheep research industry with projects investigating improvements in carcass and meat quality alongside production and reproductive traits. Nicola currently works in the CT unit at SRUC with the most recent projects focusing on measurements of genetic selection for new traits including meat quality, methane emissions and feed efficiency. So I'm sure you'll all look forward to hearing her presentation this evening on exploring meat quality. But firstly, this evening, I'd like to start the webinar by giving you a brief overview of the Red Meat Development Programme and what we are currently doing in the meat quality project. So the Red Meat Development Programme is made up of 3 different projects, the Hill Ram Scheme, the Flock and Herd Health Planning Project, known as Stock Plus, and the Welsh Lamb Meat Quality project, which we will be focusing on this evening. The Welsh Lamb Meat Quality project is focusing on on-farm and processing factors that can affect the eating quality of lamb. In trial 1, we looked at breed type, lamb gender and meat cut. Recently, we've investigated diet, growth rate and aging periods, and in the future, we are looking into investigating slaughter age and the seasonality effect on the eating quality of lamb. For trial 1, where we investigated breed type, gender and meat cut, it was found that consumers could not taste the difference between the different breed types. The 3 different breed types used in the trial were Hill, crossbred and lamb sired by a terminal ram. For the gender, consumers could neither tell the difference in the eating quality between ram lambs versus castrates, whereas with the meat cut, where consumers ate loin, chump and topside, nearly half of consumers rated the loin and chump better than everyday or premium quality. In these taste panels, the meat quality assessments done by the consumers, we have held these in 3 different locations across the UK, with each year testing the lamb meat samples on 480 consumers. These consumers have 7 samples of meat, rating them on tenderness, juiciness, flavour, aroma and overall liking, as well as giving us an indication on how much they'd be willing to pay for that meat sample. As well as these consumer taste panels, we are also undertaking some scientific analysis into the quality of the meat. We have looked into the fatty acid and mineral composition of the lamb, looking at the total fats, the N3, zinc and iron content. For the diet trial, we have also looked at the protein content to understand if lambs fed on different diets have different level in the protein readily available to the consumer as a nutritional benefit. And across the duration of the trial, we'll also be investigating different shelf life practices. So as I said with trial 2, the diet trial, we were mainly focusing on the lamb's diet, while also interested in the growth rate of the lamb, as well as looking into the meat aging period. We worked with 16 different farms across Wales that all supplied us with 9 lambs for the project. All of these lambs were ram lambs. Of these 16 farms, there was 4 different diet groups in which they were split into. These being a grass-only finishing diet, a finishing diet where the lambs were finished either on a root or brassica crop, an indoor finishing diet, or an outdoor diet where lambs were fed on grass supplemented with concentrates. All of these lambs were fed their given diet for a minimum of a 6-week period. At the start of the finishing period, the farmers sent off soil samples, and then at a weekly basis they also collected feed and forage samples for analysis. From these analyses, we will understand if the lamb's diet has changed over time and if this has affected the eating quality of the lamb, as well as investigating the nutritional benefits in the lamb's diet and if that then passes through to the meat and is readily available as a nutritional benefit for the consumer. The second aspect in which we looked at was growth rate, with farmers recording the weights of the lambs every 10 to 14 days. The farms also weighed on an individual lamb basis at the start of the 6-week finishing period and prior to slaughter. With these pre-slaughter weights, we asked the farmers not to take these within 3 days prior to slaughter, as this could increase the stress of the lambs and the likelihood of bruising, and then this would then negatively impact the eating quality of the lamb and would not represent the diet in which the lambs had been finished on. With this weight data, we asked the farms to weigh additional lambs so that we could make sure they had 9 lambs ready for their given slaughter date within the weight bracket in which we asked for the project. This weight bracket was 16 to 22 kilograms. The reason we asked for 16 to 22 kilograms was to make sure we had enough meat samples to undertake the scientific analysis, as well as having enough meat sample to have a sizable enough piece of meat for the consumers to taste at the taste panels. In total, we have weight data for 485 lambs, which we will then be able to use to see how lambs perform over a period of time according to their diet in which they are finished on, as well as relating this then to the carcass traits and qualities. And the third aspect of trial 2 was the meat aging period. The meat has been aged in the bag for either 7, 14 or 21 days. And within these meat aging periods, there's a balance of the different diets. So we can see how the meat ages over time and if that has a beneficial impact on the eating quality of the lamb. And then going forward, the next steps with the project, we're currently planning the seasonality trial. This seasonality trial will see us work with farms across Wales again and collecting lamb samples at 4 different slaughter dates. The first slaughter date will represent farms who are finishing lambs early. We will then have 2 mid-season sample collection dates. The first of these mid-season dates will represent lambs before weaning and the second lambs post-weaning. And the final sample collection date will take place in 2022, which will represent lambs that have had a longer store period and before being finished in the new year. At each of these 4 sample collection dates, we'll have a balance of ram lambs, ewe lambs and castrates. This will allow us to understand how lambs eat at different periods of the slaughter aging, as well as seeing if lambs eat better at different periods of time according to the production calendar. We also have some results pending. The first of the results will be from the feed, forage and soil samples which the farmers took throughout the diet trial. And also coming up in the next few months, we are expecting back the protein results, and this will give us an indication into if lambs fed on different diets have different protein availability within the meat for beneficial factors for the consumer. And then towards the end of the year, we are hoping to have the consumer taste panels, where 480 panellists across London, Chester and the West Midlands will taste 7 samples of meat from the diet trial. And this will allow us then to have a better understanding if diet does impact on the eating quality of lamb. So if you have any questions about the project, please feel free to add these into the chat function, and we will do our best to answer these questions at the end. But I'd now like to hand over to Nicola to give her presentation on exploring lamb eating quality. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth, and thanks to HCC for inviting me to talk tonight. Hopefully you can all hear me and see the slides okay. So I just want to talk a bit about factors affecting lamb meat quality, and some of it will be across different meat species, but I want to concentrate on lamb in particular. So just an outline to my talk. I want to first go through what I mean by lamb meat quality, consider the different traits that we're talking about in terms of meat quality, and then look at factors that can affect meat quality, particularly production factors. And then I'll touch briefly on ways of measuring meat quality, and then discuss some of the research that we've done at SRUC on lamb meat quality, and finish with some conclusions and thoughts for the future. So what determines lamb meat quality? We can think of meat quality as different traits that will appeal to the consumers. So first of all, the yield of saleable meat and the gross composition, so the amount of fat, muscle and bone in our meat. And then we can look at different aspects of the visual appearance of the meat, the tenderness or texture, the juiciness of the meat, the flavour or taste, and also the odour. And just to mention a couple of other factors that can influence consumer preference, which I've put on the list here, but I won't go into in any detail tonight. We have to also consider what I've called here wholesomeness, so things like nutritional quality, chemical safety, and microbiological safety, and also ethical quality. So whether the animals have been produced to acceptable welfare or husbandry standards, whether the workers are treated well, and increasingly important, the environmental impact of the production. So in terms of visual appearance, when we look at a piece of meat, we will look at the colour of the muscle itself. So this is controlled by myoglobin proteins. So these are iron rich and give the red or pinkish colour that we see to the meat. But also the fat colour is important for visual appearance, and this can range from a kind of greyish colour to a yellowish fat. And the amount of marbling fat that's running through the muscle gives the meat a different appearance to the consumer. Also, the firmness of the fat can be important, and the muscle shape and size. In terms of tenderness and texture, we can define tenderness as the ease of penetration of meat by the teeth, the ease of breaking meat into fragments, and the amount of residue that's remaining after chewing. So tenderness or texture depend on a few different aspects. So firstly, the size of the fibre bundles in the muscle. And the diagram that I'm showing here is a simplified cross-section through a skeletal muscle. And the red dots are the muscle fibres, and they're contained in fibre bundles. So the size of these fibres and the size of the bundles that they're contained in can affect the coarseness of the meat. Also, the amount and type of any connective tissue in the meat can affect its texture or tenderness, and also the proteins present in the muscle. Moving on to juiciness, we can define this as the wetness during the first few chews, when you get rapid release of meat fluids into the mouth, and also sustained juiciness, and this is caused by stimulation of saliva by fat. And juiciness is closely linked to what we call water holding capacity of the meat. And any reduction in this water holding capacity can lead to weeping of uncooked meat, drip in thawed meat, or shrink in cooked meats. And all of these will lead to a reduction in juiciness. In terms of flavour and taste, these really develop during the cooking process and are due to a lot of different chemical reactions that happen on heating. And the lipids in the adipose tissue or in the fat are really important for flavour in the meat. And it's been found in some studies that if meat is cooked without any associated fat, then meat from sheep, cattle and pigs can taste very similar to the human palate. So looking at factors affecting meat quality, we really have to think of things right through from production to cooking. So tonight I'll focus on some aspects really at the production end of this scale, but we also have to bear in mind that things that happen to the animals or to the meat post-production, so during transport, immediately pre-slaughter, during slaughter and immediately post-slaughter, and also how the meat's stored and prepared, and finally how it's cooked can all have impact on the eating quality of the meat. So considering production effects, I've mentioned a few categories here. So age at slaughter, sex, feeding regime, welfare, breed and genotype, and I'll discuss each of these in turn. So firstly, age effects on meat quality. And when I go through each of these points, I'm really talking across species and across the literature, so different studies that have been done in the past, and the general trends that we see in terms of these effects on meat quality. So generally in younger animals, they tend to have paler meat or paler muscle, and this becomes darker as they get older. The fat's also different. So in younger animals, it tends to be more greyish in colour and becomes yellower as they age, moving from a wetter type of fat to a firmer fat as animals get older. Also, the tenderness changes. So in general, younger animals have more tender meat, and as they get older, it tends to get coarser and there's more collagen in the meat as well, and this leads to the meat being tougher. So this coarseness is due to the muscle fibers and the fiber bundles that I mentioned when I showed the diagram before. So as these muscle fibers get bigger and the bundles that they're contained in get bigger, the texture of the meat becomes coarser and it becomes tougher. Younger animals also tend to have less fat associated with the meat, and this affects the juiciness. So as I mentioned before, increased fatness can increase the juiciness of the meat. And associated with that, the younger animals tend to have less flavour in the meat, whereas a stronger flavour develops as animals get older. Moving on to sex effects. I've split it into 3 sexes, so entire males, castrates and females, and tried to summarise general findings in the table here. So generally, entire males will have less fat at the same age or weight compared to castrates or females, and the females tend to have the highest levels of fat. The fat in the entire males tends to contain a higher proportion of water, whereas the castrates and the females have a higher lipid percentage, and that leads to a firmer fat. The entire males also tend to have coarser meat, which makes it more tough, especially as they get older, whereas the castrates and the females in comparison tend to be more tender. Also, entire males can be more prone to taints due to compounds like androstenone or skatol, and the castrates and females tend to be less susceptible to these abnormal flavours. The colour of the meat can be darker if entire males are uncastrated and tends to be paler after castration. Moving on to the nutritional effects on meat quality. So here I've tried to generalise into what I've called a high plane of nutrition or a low plane of nutrition. So a high plane of nutrition would be fast growth, for example, on a high concentrate diet. And this tends to lead to fatter, let me just go back up again. Fatter carcasses with more marbling fat or intramuscular fat. It also tends to produce more lipid in the fat and less water, and that gives a firmer fat texture. And also the higher plane of nutrition leads to more unsaturated fatty acids, and this tends to increase as the percentage of concentrates in the diet increases. The animals that are reared on a lower plane of nutrition to achieve a slower growth pattern tend to have darker meat, and we can also see darker meat as a result of more iron in the diet as well. And those in a low plane of nutrition also tend to have a softer fat. Other nutritional effects particular to animals reared on pasture are that sometimes you can get a yellower colour to the fat due to the pigment in the vegetation that the animals are grazing. And at different times of year, you can have different effects due to the seasonal nature of the herbage. So animals grazing on young herbage will tend to have softer fat. And some plants can also affect flavour or lead to taints in the meat, for example, due to skatol. In terms of welfare effects on meat quality, we know that high welfare can lead to animals eating more and growing more quickly, and this can have effects on the yield of the carcass and the composition, so the balance between fat, muscle and bone in the carcass at a given weight. Also, it's important to avoid stress or trauma for meat quality because this can affect things like colour, water holding capacity, juiciness and flavour. And we know that also rough handling or overcrowding prior to slaughter can cause bruising, as well as the same effects as any stress or trauma prior to slaughter. Different breeds can also have different meat quality for several reasons. So if we think across a diverse range of breeds, some tend to deposit more meat in the higher price cuts compared to the lower price cuts. And there can also be differences in terms of where different breeds deposit fat. So a cattle example is a Hereford. They tend to lay down more fat in the brisket area compared to other breeds. Also fat partitioning, so how the fat is distributed in the different layers of the body. So dairy breeds, both cattle and sheep breeds, we know they tend to deposit a larger proportion of fat in the internal depots, so around internal organs, and less in the carcass. Also fat colour can change depending on breed, and there's evidence again from cattle that the Channel Island breeds, for example, have a yellower fat colour than some of the other breeds, and this is for genetic reasons, even if they're finished on the same diets. There can also be differences between breeds in terms of tenderness, and this is quite often linked to mature size. So these fibre bundles and the fibre size that I spoke about before, they can lead to coarseness in the muscle if they're from a larger sized breed compared to smaller breeds. And even within breed, we know that there can be genetic effects on meat quality traits. And we can think of this in different ways. So if there's been genetic selection within a breed for carcass composition, it can have effects on meat quality. So thinking across species again, we know that animals that have been extensively selected for lean meat yield or muscling, it can have effects on meat quality. So pigs, for example, that have been selected for very high lean meat yield tend to have softer, more watery fat. And animals that have been selected for low fat content tend to have lower flavour or juiciness in meat quality tests. There's a few examples of direct genetic selection for lamb meat eating quality traits, and these have become more numerous in recent years. So traits like meat colour and meat pH have been part of the breeding programmes in New Zealand and Australia. And in recent years, intramuscular fat, which I've called IMF here, so that's the marbling fat, has been predicted in UK terminal sire breeds. So both Signet and Innovis use predictors of intramuscular fat to produce breeding values for their customers. So most meat eating quality traits do show genetic variability, and I've shown some examples in the table here. So ranging from low heritability up to moderate to high. So this suggests that there should be the ability to change meat eating quality by selective breeding within a sheep breed. Another thing to consider when we're thinking about genetic effects on meat quality is that occasionally you get these major genes or single genes that have a very large effect on carcass and meat quality traits. And there's examples from across the different species, but in sheep, there are two which have been researched quite closely. The first is a callipese gene. So this was a gene that has been found across several sheep populations and has a really extreme effect on muscling, particularly in the back end. And the picture at the bottom here, the sheep numbered 1 and 3 carry the callipese gene, and the sheep number 2 and 4 from the same population don't carry this gene. And you can see the huge effect that's having on the muscling in the back end. So as well as having this very positive effect on the carcass lean meat yield, the researchers found that actually has a very negative effect on meat quality traits. So it reduces the overall carcass fat, but also greatly reduces marbling fat and tenderness of the meat. So this has actually been selected against in sheep breeding programs now. And a much more moderate major gene that's been found in studies in New Zealand is the Carwell or Loinmax gene. So again, this is known to increase lean meat yield, and particularly in the eye muscle in this case, but with a much more moderate effect than the callipese gene. And although this has a slightly negative effect on tenderness, the research has found that by enhancing the processing, you can eliminate that negative effect. So moving on to some of the research that's been done on lamb meat eating quality. There was a series of reports done in the early 2000s funded by Scottish Government looking at meat eating quality in lamb, beef and pork, and looking across the supply chain, similar to the work that's now been done by HCC in Wales. And for the lamb trial, they looked at 22 farms and 3 abattoirs and concentrated on 2 of the breed types most important in Scotland, so the Scottish blackface and also crossbred lambs. And the study looked at the effects of different pre-slaughter protocols, different slaughter weights and different processing protocols. So just to summarise some of the results from that work. They found few pre-slaughter effects on meat quality, but most of the farms that were contributing to the trial had best practice. So with a good level of pre-slaughter management on the farm, then the effects on meat quality were minimised. The things they did point out were it's important to avoid growth checks and it's important to avoid stressors pre-slaughter in terms of meat quality. They found that increasing carcasses to slightly heavier than the recommended levels, which were 16 kilos for the Scottish blackface and 23 for the crossbreds, actually had negligible effects on the texture and flavour. And this was one of the drivers of the looking at the carcass weights, was that the producers were limited in the amount of money they got for taking carcasses heavier, but if they managed to do that at an acceptable fat level, then actually the meat quality was still acceptable. In terms of the post-slaughter processing and conditioning protocols, this was what really had the major impact on eating quality attributes. So they found that by enhancing the processing and conditioning protocols, they had major positive impact on all of the eating quality attributes and improved consistency of texture in particular. And this was across all the breeds, abattoirs and pre-slaughter treatments that they looked at. There was also seasonal effects found, which were minor on texture, but more pronounced in terms of abnormal flavour in late season lamb. However, they did find breed differences in this as well. So this abnormal flavour was more common in the crossbred lambs than in the Scottish blackface lambs. But one thing that came out of the report as well was that there's substantial variation due to individual animals. So even within one breed, there seemed to be a lot of genetic variation in terms of meat quality. So there's various ways we can measure meat quality, and I won't go through this in any detail, but I've put up some pictures of various instruments that can be used to measure some of these traits that I've spoken about. So ranging from colour through to fatty acid profiles. But a lot of these tests are very time consuming and require samples of meat to be taken to labs and to be analysed in detail using destructive tests. Because my personal interest is in breeding, so I'm a sheep geneticist, what I really would like to concentrate on is ways of measuring meat quality that could be incorporated into breeding programs. And so for that, you really need something that is non-destructive so that you can do it at minimum cost, and you could hopefully do it with high throughput on a large number of animals. So for our research, we've looked at a couple of possible measurement technologies that have the potential to be used, for example, in breeding programs. And I just want to mention a couple of these before I describe the research that we've done at SRUC. So one is visible and near infrared spectroscopy, and there's some pictures here of it being used in cattle, and the smaller scanning heads are usually used for sheep So it can be used directly on the meat, either on any cut surface, so either in the abattoir or in the lab. And it shines a light onto the meat surface and measures reflection spectra. So it's really picking up specific molecules. And one example is the carbon-hydrogen bonds and fatty acids that it picks up. And it produces data, and you can see on the computer screen, the background here, there's a spectra of data that's produced. So the shape of this curve is slightly different for each sample that's measured, and you can take data from these readings and use that to predict different meat quality traits. And they've found good relationships of these data with meat quality traits such as colour, cooking loss, composition, intramuscular fat and fatty acids, as well as mechanical tenderness and some of the sensory traits. The other non-invasive technology that I wanted to mention was computed tomography, or CT scanning. So this can be done on meat cuts as well, and this is an example in the picture here of some meat being scanned. And it uses different tissue densities to discriminate between different tissues. So you can see in the 3D image, the muscle shows up as red, the fat as green, and the white, the bone as white in this picture here. And it can be, you can get this information even from scanning packaged meat, so vacuum packed cuts of meat from sheep and cattle have been put through the CT scanner. And this gives very good predictions of the composition as well as intramuscular fat and fatty acid profile, and the meat can then go back into the supply chain after being scanned. So just to pick up a bit more on the role of fat, a lot of the research that we've done into meat quality at SRUC has focused on intramuscular fat, or the marbling fat within the muscle. And fat has a bit of a complex relationship with consumer preference, because we know that the level of visible fat in lamb can influence consumers at the point of purchase. So lamb is often perceived as a fatty meat, and too much subcutaneous fat, or the fat surrounding the meat, can put consumers off buying it. But we also know that meat eating quality, so the traits like tenderness and juiciness that I've mentioned tonight, are linked to fat levels in a positive way. So a higher amount of that intramuscular or marbling fat leads to higher tenderness, juiciness, and flavour. So if we think of fat within a breeding programme, what we should be aiming for is maintaining meat eating quality at the same time as trying to reduce the overall carcass fatness and increase carcass leanness. And I think we have to take a lesson from the pig industry here, because they were quite a few years ahead of sheep breeding in terms of genetic selection, and selecting pig carcasses for higher leanness has resulted in extremely low intramuscular fat in some lines, and this has had a negative effect on pork eating quality. So this has been the focus of a lot of our research at SRUC, looking at intramuscular fat and its relationship with meat quality. And trying to find a threshold for what we should be looking for in terms of intramuscular fat is quite difficult. So looking back at the literature, there's different recommendations. So the first bullet point there were 2 different European studies that found that acceptable levels of intramuscular fat in the loin were above 2 or 3% for grilled red meat cuts of beef and lamb. However, the second study here was an Australian study, and they found that the consumers required over 5% for what they called better than everyday eating quality. And we know that there are differences in consumer preferences between different countries. However, in the studies that we'd carried out at SRUC, where we'd done lab tests to measure intramuscular fat in different lamb breeds, we'd found averages below these levels in a lot of our trials. So the texels that we'd measured in different trials, the average levels of intramuscular fat were about 1.4 to 1.6%, so below all of these thresholds that had been published. Whereas trials on Texel cross mule lambs and Scottish blackface lambs fell just above 2%. And it may be that we have to consider intramuscular fat differently within different populations. And we found that when we compared the relationship between intramuscular fat and taste panel overall liking scores, there's a much higher relationship in our Texel project than there had been with the Scottish blackface lambs. So in those lambs that had lower overall levels of intramuscular fat, it became a more important predictor of taste panel overall liking. So it's likely that intramuscular fat is more important for sensory traits in these very lean breeds. And this reinforces concerns about the impact of reducing fat on eating quality. So we expanded on this a bit in another study, and here we used two divergent breeds, so the Scottish blackface and the Texel. And most of the studies that we'd found reported no breed differences or small breed differences on eating quality. But most of them were between similar breeds, so between different terminal sire breeds, for example, or between pure and crossbred lambs that were kept in similar systems. So we actually wanted to see if we could pick up any differences between animals that were extreme in terms of eating quality. So we looked at Scottish blackface lambs, a traditional hill breed, and Texel lambs, which are a traditional terminal sire breed that have been selected for carcass leanness. And in our trial, we managed them very similarly. So to try and pick up any differences, we standardized the rearing environment as far as possible. So they were actually reared as one flock together on lowland pastures. And even when they were slaughtered at the same endpoints, we found that the Scottish blackface had higher levels of intramuscular fat than the Texels on average. And in taste panel tests, the Scottish blackface lambs had higher scores for tenderness, flavour, and overall liking. And we took samples from the muscles of the two different breeds, and we did some histology in the lab with Glasgow University, and found that the Texels actually had differences in terms of the fibres and the muscles. So they had higher fibre numbers and higher muscle density compared to the Scottish blackface, as well as having lower intramuscular fat. And the Scottish blackface had a higher percentage of oxidative muscle fibres, and this is a type of muscle fibre that's known to improve eating quality. But again, even within these two breeds, we found substantial within-breed variation, suggesting that there was potential for genetic selection within breed as well. So a more recent study, which we called the Taste versus Waste project, concentrated on crossbred lambs. So they were all sired by Texel sires with Scotch mule dams. And the first part of this project was really to look again at that relationship between intramuscular fat and eating quality, and to establish whether we could confirm that link. So the top graph there shows the taste panel scores here on the y-axis. So a higher score is preferred, and then intramuscular fat levels in 1% categories along the bottom. And I'll just point out that we actually had very few samples in this higher than 5% group. So we can really interpret this last point on the graph with some caution. But looking at the levels before that, we can see that in each of the taste panel traits, we see an increase in taste panel liking as the amount of intramuscular fat increased. And as part of this project, we looked at two of the technologies that I mentioned earlier, so the visible and near infrared spectroscopy and the CT scanning of the lamb loin cuts to see if we could predict intramuscular fat. And with both of these technologies, we found that they could predict intramuscular fat with moderate to high accuracy in a non-destructive way. So we could scan the cuts and then return them to the food chain and feed that information back into the breeding programme. And when we did that, we found that these intramuscular fat predictors using either of the technologies had a moderate heritability of 21% for CT and 29% for the visible in NIR spectroscopy. So there is potential there to use some of these technologies in a breeding programme if the infrastructure could be put in place. And just to look at the bottom graph here, so this split the samples into either greater than 3% intramuscular fat as predicted by CT compared to those that had less than 3% intramuscular fat predicted by CT. And you can see that there's significant difference between these two groups in terms of the taste panel scores that they got for texture, flavour, juiciness and overall liking. So in each case, we're again seeing this improvement in eating quality as intramuscular fat increased. And the beauty of CT is that as well as predicting meat quality, and in particular intramuscular fat from scanning meat cuts, we can also carry this out in live lambs as well. And this is really the holy grail for animal breeding and for genetic selection. We want something that we can measure in the live animals that are selection candidates for breeding themselves. And unlike in beef and pork, marbling is not as easy to see in lamb muscle. Efforts in the past to try and use ultrasound scanning to predict intramuscular fat in lamb has resulted in poor predictions. So with beef and pork, you can see the ribbons of marbling and the speckles of marbling using ultrasound, but that's not proved possible with lamb. And if you think of lamb meat, you very rarely see ribbons of marbling fat running through the big muscles. It tends to be more speckled throughout the meat. And what this does is it reduces the density of the meat, because we know that lean meat or muscle is more dense than fat. So having more fat speckled through the meat reduces the average density. And because this is what CT scanning is picking up on, so it's measuring tissue density, we can use the distribution of the density values in the pixels in the image to predict intramuscular fat levels in the meat. And we can do this in live lambs. So at the moment, there's a few hundred breeding ram lambs CT scanned every year as part of the national terminal sire breeding programs. So this is now another trait that we can measure from the images that we're collecting from these CT scanned ram lambs and feed back into the breeding programs. And we know that these CT predictors of intramuscular fat are over 65% accurate. And some work at the Rosen Institute found that they were very highly correlated with taste panel scores of flavour, juiciness, and overall liking. And then some further work looking at CT predicted intramuscular fat in Texel lambs by Neil Cleland and his PhD found that it was a heritable trait, so around a heritability of about 0.3, so it was quite moderately heritable, and also that the genetic control was partially different from that of total carcass fat. What this means is that we could select against carcass fat and for intramuscular fat and try and find those animals that have a high level of intramuscular fat and not such a high level of total carcass fat. And now breeding values, or EBVs, for CT predicted intramuscular fat are available in UK breeding programmes. So through Signet and also Innovis use these EBVs as well in their breeding programmes. So taking this further, this is some results from a PhD that Hilary Thomas undertook at Aberystwyth University. So Hilary now works for HCC, but she did her PhD at Aberystwyth and was also in collaboration with Innovis. And they looked at crossbred lambs from Abermac sires. And these sires had a range of muscle density EBVs as measured with CT scanning. As they followed the crossbred lambs from these sires and measured a lot of meat quality traits on them post-slaughter. And Hilary found that when she compared the low CT muscle density EBV sires to those that had a higher EBV, the low sires had higher levels of intramuscular fat and were tender, juicy, and greater overall liking in the meat as scored by taste panels. The meat had lower shear force and toughness and higher meat colour traits, and as well as lower polyunsaturated to saturated fat ratio. So there was a definite difference coming through in the crossbred slaughter lambs from these sires that had divergent EBVs for this measure of CT muscle density as a predictor of intramuscular fat. And Hilary's work's just been published in the journal Animal. So just to try and conclude where we've got to with some of the things I've discussed tonight. So it seems that meat quality traits can be affected by aspects of production and genetics, although it may be that the processing effects are larger, and that was what was found in the CRAD reports. So that's going to have a large effect, as well as the production and genetic effects. We know that fat plays a very important role in meat quality and should be considered carefully in any breeding programme. And non-invasive technologies are now developing to a point where they can be used to measure or predict meat quality traits with potential to use them within breeding programs. But probably in reality, it's going to be a combination of measures across the supply chain that will be most effective for improving meat eating quality. So there's not really one easy fix. We have to consider really the whole supply chain. And then within the supply chain that we want to focus on, it's really important to understand the effects of the different factors within that specific supply chain. And by understanding that, we can then try to see how we can best make these improvements to meat quality across the supply chain. So thanks very much for listening to me tonight. And I just want to acknowledge some of the funders of the work that I've spoken about, and thanks again to HCC for letting me talk tonight.
Thank you, Nicola, for that really informative presentation of exploring lamb meat quality. I'm sure we've all learnt some useful information from this evening's webinar. So I'd like to now start the questions. We've had a lot of questions through, so thank you for everybody who has asked those questions. We do our best to answer them in the 10 minutes we have remaining, but for those that we can't answer, we'll do our best as well to type a response to you in the Q&A function that we have on this platform. So the first question, do you see any possibility of developing any indicator in the live animal to predict eating quality?
As far as I know, the CT scanning, so that's been found to be able to predict intramuscular fat and potentially fatty acid profile. And I think that's one of the few positive indicators in live animals that I know of. I know, like I mentioned, in beef cattle, intramuscular fat can be predicted by ultrasound scanning, and it's the same with pigs, but they hadn't been very successful at doing that with lamb so far.
Okay, thank you. And then we've got another question in here. given the potential for genetic selection within breed, which traits would you prioritise to improve lamb meat quality?
Yeah, I think it all has to be as part of a combined breeding index. So definitely still with an eye on carcass quality, which is still what farmers will get paid on. But I think intramuscular fat is perhaps one of the easier wins. It seems to be something that is heritable and can be predicted by a number of these technologies. Colour is also fairly easy to measure in a non-invasive, non-destructive way, but potentially isn't seen as much of an issue, especially with lamb.
Okay, thank you. We've had quite a few questions as well that are relating to the marketing side of what we do at HCC and how we're using the meat quality project to be able to promote this. So I will try and summarise all of those questions together in an answer, because we have had quite a few questions that are based along that. So when the consumers come to the taste panels, when they first come in, they come in groups of 20 to sample these 7 pieces of meat, and they've all come from different backgrounds, and we are unsure or unaware of their backgrounds, and they answer some demographic questions so we can get some more information that our marketing department can then use to see how people from different demographic backgrounds have different views on lamb, and use that for the promotion in the future. And what we can do at the taste panels, after the consumers have had their samples and have rated their samples, we then give a presentation to them. We give this after the taste panels, so not to influence their thoughts and their perceptions towards the eating quality of lamb. During this presentation then, this is given by one of the members of HCC's marketing team that gives an update on what they are doing to promote Welsh lamb, as well as beef, and then also giving them an insight into what the farmers do in Wales. And we do this through we've got a video of different farmers talking about their systems and what they do to ensure high meat quality, high welfare standards, as well as sustainability and benefits the environment. And during this discussion as well, that the marketing department give, and they also talk about the nutritional benefits of eating red meat, and then hopefully then the consumers go away more informed and are able then to use that to inform their decisions when buying meat. Also at the taste panels, we give the consumers a recipe bag, and in this recipe bag then there's different recipes for cooking lamb, from things that you can use with your leftover Sunday roast to methods of cooking for children, as well as recipes into something different, because sometimes people find it difficult to think of something different to do with lamb. So we give them a big variety of choice at the taste panels, and hope to use that as a platform, not only to find out what the consumers think of lamb, but also as well to promote Welsh lamb, as well as red meat. Okay then, so and Nicola, do you think that the consumers would benefit more if farmers were paid for eating quality rather than quality of production?
Potentially. Yeah, I think it's quite a difficult one to implement, and it would definitely, I think they would still have to have, whether it's a Europe grid or not, some sort of scoring of total fat and leanness in some way. So there's been quite a lot of interest in using things like video image analysis to get a more subjective scores of fat and lean meat yield, for example. But yes, I suppose if there's more of a real drive from farmers to try and, or a clear message to farmers of what traits it is they should improve, then I think that could be beneficial.
Yeah, I agree. I think before we would do that, we'd also want to understand what the consumers see as quality, and that's what we're trying to do through the Meat Quality Project. And then we'd be able to use this technologies in the future to be able to tailor that to what the consumer wants. But before that, we need to understand what the consumer does want, and also see what the industry wants and how the industry wants to drive forward within the improvements in meat quality.
And I think as well, like a lot of people would comment that lamb meat quality is fine. You know, it's nowhere near got to where pork is, where fat's got so low that it's had a negative impact on eating quality. But I think we need to learn the lesson before we get to that point. You know, if we're heading in that direction, we have to make sure that we know the relationships with eating quality traits from what we are selecting for.
Okay, thank you. So we've also had some questions based on the first trial that we carried out, looking into breed type, muscle cut, as well as gender. And the questions were based upon if diet was recorded in this trial. Yes, we did record diet in this trial, but it was not balanced. In the first trial, our main focus was on the breed type and the gender, finding out how that on-farm factors affected the eating quality. But we also asked each farmer of the 22 farmers that we worked with in trial 1 some background farm production information, and then we were then able to measure then the differences in eating quality according to diet, and then we were using that as a baseline then to be able to see where we should plan from for trial 2, and that's where we come to the conclusion in the 4 different diets that we used, of grass, indoor finishing, grass and concentrate finishing system, as well as that final production system where farmers were finishing lambs on either a brassica or root crop. Okay, we've got time for a few more questions. When you talked about the technologies, pH was mentioned. How are processors using pH to predict eating quality of lamb?
Yeah, so pH can be very important for predicting particularly any problems that could occur with eating quality. So the ideal is that pH will drop after slaughter, and the ideal is for it to settle around 5.5, and this is in sheep. This is usually after about 12 to 24 hours. If that ultimate pH is too high or too low, it can have effects on eating quality. I think with cattle more than sheep, but also in sheep, the tendency would be for it to be too high. And that can be linked to stress before slaughter. And then if the pH doesn't fall far enough and it's too high, that can affect the colour of the meat. So it tends to be darker and firmer, what they might call dark cutting meat. And that can then lead to reduced juiciness, and also have problems with microbial spoilage, so reducing the shelf life if that pH is too high. I don't know how much that's being recorded routinely in abattoirs at the moment. Not that I'm aware of, but I'm not sure.
Thank you. Yeah, with in regards to the pH then, it's something that we have looked at in the project as well. And then on a randomised sample basis, we will be checking the pH decline of the lambs on that day of slaughter, just to make sure that there is no impact of that day of slaughter on the eating quality experience in which the consumers are experiencing at the taste panels. Okay, so we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So I have a question based around entire ram lambs. So would you say that entire male lambs slaughtered during the breeding season could be giving consumers a bad eating quality experience?
I think there is potential to. I know a couple of trials have found that there aren't significant differences between entire males and castrates. and even at later in the season, in the autumn, towards the breeding season. But then there is evidence of some trials where they have seen abnormal flavours increase in entire males, and I know that in Norway they find it quite a big problem. So I'm not sure if that could be linked to breed or to management systems or diets, for example. So there is the potential, I suppose. But I don't think you didn't find differences in your trial.
Yeah, I agree with what you said. There has been some trials out there that have found a difference in the eating quality of rams versus castrates, or even versus ewe lambs. So that some consumers may have had bad experiences perhaps of ram lambs, and that is linked to that certain period of time during the mating season. But in trial 1, where we investigated ram lambs versus castrates, we didn't find, or the consumers didn't find, a difference. They didn't detect ram lambs more than castrates, or vice versa. And from that, then we are going to use what we found in trial 1, and just to give it more evidence behind it through the seasonality trial, and where we'll also have ewe lambs to compare to. In trial 1, we only took the samples at one given period of time in the year, and that was November, December time. So with the seasonality trial, by taking 4 different samples of lambs throughout the production calendar, we'll then be able to understand in more detail if there is an effect by having those different dates, and if it is at different times of year, because some research has found that there is an effect of ram lambs at a certain time of year, but after the mating season, then the effect is reduced, and then consumers can't detect the difference. So it is ongoing research is needed in that area, just to make sure if there is a difference and how those differences can be minimised, so there is no bad experience of eating quality for the consumer. Okay. I think that is all we have time for in terms of the questions. Thank you all for your questions. We have had a lot of questions, and it's really appreciated. It shows the level of engagement to Nicola's presentation, which is really positive for this evening's webinar. So thank you, Nicola, for joining us this evening. Any remaining questions, we'll do our best to answer them, and we can type a response back. But I'd like to conclude the webinar now in thanking you all for joining this evening. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr.
Thank you.